The telegram arrived on the morning Victoria Sutton buried her husband, though she would not read it until 3 days later, when the fog of grief and whiskey fumes finally cleared from the tiny cabin she had called home for 2 years. Thomas had been 31 years old when his liver gave out, his body pickled from the inside by cheap rot gut and expensive bourbon alike, and the women of Salida, Colorado whispered their warnings as they brought casseroles and pitying glances to her doorstep in the autumn of 1876. Her first husband drank himself to an early grave, Mrs. Henderson said to Mrs. Palmer, as they stood in Victoria's kitchen arranging food she would not eat. Mark my words, she will be cautious now. No woman wants to bury two. Victoria heard them through the thin walls, but said nothing. She was 24 years old, a widow with no children and no prospects, living in a mining town where men outnumbered women 10 to 1, and most of them spent their wages on liquor and cards. Thomas had been a clerk at the assay office, an educated man from Boston who had promised her a good life when they married in Denver. Instead, he had slowly dissolved into a bottle, coming home later each night, his breath sour and his eyes vacant, until one morning he simply did not wake up. The telegram was from her brother in Kansas City, offering condolences and a train ticket home. Victoria held it in her hands and looked around the cabin. Everything here belonged to Thomas, or to his memory, or to the failure they had built together. She had $23 to her name and a wedding ring she could not bring herself to sell. The rent was paid through the end of October, which gave her 2 weeks to decide what kind of woman she would become. She chose to stay, not out of love for Salida, which was a rough town even by Colorado standards, but because going home meant admitting defeat to her family, who had warned her against marrying Thomas in the first place. Her father had seen the drinking even then, during their brief courtship, but Victoria had been young and stubborn and certain she could save him. Now she knew better. Some men could not be saved. They had to save themselves, and Thomas had never wanted to. The work she found was at the general store, helping Mrs. Chen with inventory and serving customers 6 days a week for $3 and meals. It was honest work and it kept her hands busy, which was all she wanted. The miners came in for supplies and tobacco, their faces weathered and their manners rough but mostly respectful. They called her Mrs. Sutton and tipped their hats, and if some of them looked at her with interest that went beyond commerce, they kept their distance. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, snow was already piling up in the mountain passes, and the talk in town turned to who would make it through and who would not. Salida sat at 7,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that scraped 14,000, and when the storms came down from those heights, they came with a vengeance. It was during one of these early storms that Victoria first heard about Xerxes Xander. She was closing up the store one evening when a group of miners came in, stamping snow from their boots and arguing about supplies. One of them, a grizzled man named Cooper, was insisting they needed more rope for a rescue operation. "That mountain man up in the high country, the one they call Xander," Cooper said. "He pulled the Morrison boy out of a ravine last week, carried him 6 miles through a blizzard. Doc says the boy would have died for sure if not for him." "I heard he lives up there year-round," another miner said. "Build himself a cabin at 10,000 feet, traps and hunts, comes down maybe twice a year for supplies." "He is a strange one," Cooper agreed. "Big as a bear and twice as mean, they say. But he knows those mountains better than any man alive." Victoria measured out the rope and took their money, filing the name away without much interest. Mountain men were common enough in Colorado, solitary souls who preferred the company of elk and eagles to their fellow humans. She had no reason to think she would ever meet this Xerxes Xander, much less that he would change everything about the life she was carefully rebuilding. But fate, Victoria would learn, had a sense of humor about such things. The real cold came in December. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there, and the snow kept falling until the drifts reached the second-story windows of the taller buildings. The stage stopped running, and the train came through only twice a week, struggling through the passes. Salida hunkered down for the long mountain winter, and people stopped going out unless they had to. Victoria walked to the store each morning in the dark, her breath freezing in clouds around her face, her fingers numb even inside her mittens. Mrs. Chen had given her a better coat, thick wool with a fur collar, and she was grateful for it. The cabin was cold at night despite the fire, and she slept in all her clothes, piling every blanket she owned onto the narrow bed. She did not mind the cold or the isolation. Both felt appropriate, a physical manifestation of the emotional landscape she had been inhabiting since Thomas died. She went through her days with quiet efficiency, speaking when spoken to, smiling at the appropriate times, but keeping the core of herself locked away where grief and shame could not quite reach it. It was 2 days before Christmas when everything changed. Victoria was alone in the store that afternoon. Mrs. Chen had gone to visit her sister in the Chinese section of town, trusting Victoria to mind things until closing. Business was slow, just a few customers buying last-minute supplies or tobacco. She was adding figures in the ledger when the door opened and a blast of Arctic air swept through the store. The man who entered had to duck his head to clear the doorframe. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire doorway. His face was mostly hidden by a thick beard crusted with ice, and he wore a heavy fur coat that made him look even larger. He carried a rifle slung across his back and moved with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior, and Victoria felt her breath catch. She had never seen anyone quite like him. He was all muscle and weathered strength, his hands scarred and capable, his presence filling the small store like a force of nature. "Afternoon," he said, his voice deep and rough from disuse. "I need supplies." Victoria found her voice. "Of course. What do you need?" He began listing items, practical things like coffee and flour and ammunition, and she gathered them on the counter. His eyes followed her movements, and she was acutely aware of being watched, though not in the way the miners sometimes watched her. This was different, more measuring than appreciative. "You are new," he said as she wrapped his purchases in brown paper. "Were not here last time I came down." "I've been here since October," Victoria said. "I work for Mrs. Chen." "You're the widow," he said, and it was not a question. Victoria's hand stilled on the package. "Yes. I'm sorry for your loss." He said it simply, without the cloying sympathy she had endured from the church ladies. It sounded genuine. "Thank you," she said. "That will be $4.30. He paid in silver coins, counting them out carefully, and then gathered his packages. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. "Storm coming tonight," he said. "Big one. Make sure you are somewhere warm." Then he was gone, leaving only wet footprints on the floor and the lingering cold from outside. Mrs. Chen returned an hour later, and Victoria mentioned the large man who had bought supplies. "Ah, that must be Xander," Mrs. Chen said, smiling. "He comes down from his cabin a few times each winter. Very reliable customer. Always pays in silver." "The miners talk about him," Victoria said, trying to sound casual. "They say he lives alone up in the mountains." "For many years now," Mrs. Chen confirmed. "He came here after the war, I think. Wanted to get away from people. But he is a good man, even if he is strange. He has helped many people over the years." Victoria thought about this as she finished her work for the day. A man who chose isolation, who had seen enough of civilization to reject it entirely. She understood that impulse, perhaps better than she would have admitted. The storm Xander had predicted arrived after midnight, howling down from the peaks with a fury that shook the cabin walls. Victoria lay in her bed and listened to the wind scream, grateful she had stocked extra firewood. By morning, there was 3 feet of new snow on the ground, and more still falling. The store was closed for 2 days while the town dug itself out. Victoria stayed in her cabin, reading by firelight and rationing her food. When she finally made it back to work, Mrs. Chen told her that 2 miners had gotten lost in the storm trying to reach their claim. "Search party found them this morning," Mrs. Chen said. "Frozen solid, poor souls. They were only a mile from town but could not find their way in the whiteout." Victoria thought of Xander in his high cabin, alone in the storm, and wondered how anyone survived up there. It seemed impossible, a defiance of nature itself. Christmas came and went quietly. Victoria attended services at the small church and accepted an invitation to Christmas dinner from the Hendersons, who meant well even if their pity was exhausting. She smiled and ate ham and pretended to be more cheerful than she felt, and when she finally escaped back to her cabin, she sat by the fire and let herself cry for the first time since the funeral. She was not crying for Thomas exactly. She was crying for the version of herself who had believed in happy endings, who had thought love could conquer anything, who had been so young and so foolish. That girl was gone now, buried alongside her husband, and Victoria did not know yet who she was becoming in her place. The new year arrived with temperatures so cold that water froze solid in pipes and people burned furniture to stay warm. The supply wagons could not get through, and food became scarce. Mrs. Chen started rationing what they had in the store, selling only essentials and turning away anyone who wanted luxuries. It was in mid-January when Victoria saw Xander again. She was walking home from the store, her head down against the wind, when she heard a commotion near the livery stable. A group of men had gathered, and their voices carried across the frozen street. "I am telling you, we need to send someone up there before they starve," one man was saying. "Nobody can get through that pass in this weather," another argued. "It would be suicide." Victoria stopped, curious despite herself. A tall figure emerged from the livery, and she recognized Xander immediately. He was dressed in the same heavy furs, his rifle across his back, and he was leading a massive pack mule loaded with supplies. "I will go," he said simply. "Xander, that pass is snowed in," the first man said. "Even you cannot get through." "I can get through," Xander said. His voice was calm, stating a fact rather than boasting. "How many are up there?" 4 families, maybe 20 people total, including children. Xander nodded and checked the mule's load. "I will need more food, and blankets." The men scattered to gather what he needed, and Victoria found herself walking toward him before she had consciously decided to move. He looked up as she approached, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise. "You are going up into the mountains in this weather?" she asked. "People need help," he said, as if that explained everything. "The men said it was too dangerous." "For them, maybe." He adjusted a rope on the mule's pack, his movements efficient and practiced. "I know the way." "Why do you do it?" The question came out before Victoria could stop it. "Risk your life for strangers." Xander looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were a startling pale blue, almost gray, and there was something ancient in them, like he had seen too much and learned to carry it quietly. "Because I can," he said finally, "and because nobody else will." The men returned with more supplies, and Xander loaded them onto the mule with practiced ease. Victoria watched him work, fascinated by the economy of his movements, the sheer strength evident in the way he hefted 100-pound sacks like they weighed nothing. He was a wall of muscle beneath those furs, his body honed by years of surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. "How long will you be gone?" someone asked. 3 days, maybe 4, Xander said. "Depends on the snow." He swung up onto a massive horse that looked barely adequate to carry his weight, took the mule's lead rope, and headed out of town without another word. Victoria watched him disappear into the white wilderness, and something in her chest tightened with an emotion she could not name. He returned 5 days later, gaunt and exhausted, but alive. The families he had rescued came down 2 days after that, full of stories about how he had broken trail through 8-foot drifts, how he had carried the children on his back when they were too tired to walk, how he had given them his own food when theirs ran out. "He is a miracle," one woman told Victoria in the store. "A guardian angel in furs." But when Victoria saw him again, briefly, as he bought more supplies before heading back to his cabin, he looked anything but angelic. He looked tired and human, his face drawn and his movements slower than before. He nodded to her but did not speak, and she wondered what it cost him, this constant helping of others while living apart from them. February brought a brief warm spell, a few days of temperatures above freezing that turned the snow to slush and made everyone dream of spring. Victoria celebrated her 25th birthday alone, marking the occasion with a piece of cake Mrs. Chen had baked. Another year older, another year wiser, another year alone. She was surprised to find that she did not mind the solitude as much as she had expected. After 2 years of walking on eggshells around Thomas's drinking, of managing his moods and his mistakes, there was something restful about answering only to herself. She could read late into the night if she wanted, or go to bed at sunset. She could eat bread and cheese for dinner, or nothing at all. Her life was small and quiet, but it was hers. The warm spell ended abruptly, and winter returned with a vengeance. Another storm, another week of being trapped indoors, another round of men coming into the store with frostbitten fingers and stories of narrow escapes. Victoria learned to read the sky like the old-timers did, to see the storms coming in the color of the clouds and the behavior of the birds. She thought about Xander more often than she wanted to admit. Something about him had gotten under her skin, into her thoughts during quiet moments. She told herself it was just curiosity, that anyone would be intrigued by someone who chose such an extreme way of life. But she knew it was more than that. There was something about his quiet competence, his utter self-sufficiency, that called to something deep in her own nature. March arrived with howling winds and more snow. Victoria had been in Salida for 5 months, and she felt like a different person than the shell-shocked widow who had arrived in October. She was stronger now, both physically and mentally. The work at the store had put muscle on her frame, and the mountain air had brought color to her cheeks. She still thought about Thomas, but the sharp edge of grief had dulled to a manageable ache. It was in early March when the accident happened. Victoria was walking home from the store at dusk, taking her usual route past the church and down the alley behind the dry goods shop. She did not see the ice patch until she was already falling, and she went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sickening pop. Pain exploded up her leg, bright and consuming, and she cried out before she could stop herself. She tried to stand and nearly blacked out from the agony. Her ankle would not support her weight, and she was alone in the alley with night falling and the temperature already dropping below 0. Panic fluttered in her chest. If she could not get home, if she stayed out here all night, she would freeze to death. "Help!" she called out, but her voice sounded small and weak against the wind. "Please, someone help me." She tried to crawl, dragging herself through the snow with her hands, but it was hopeless. The pain in her ankle was blinding, and she was already starting to shiver. This was how it ended, she thought with detached horror. This was how she would die, alone in an alley, frozen like those miners who had gotten lost in the storm. Then she heard footsteps, heavy and quick, and a massive figure appeared at the end of the alley. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating, that the cold had already gotten to her brain, but then he was kneeling beside her, and she could smell wood smoke and leather and pine, and she knew it was real. "Xander," she breathed. "What happened?" His hands were already moving over her, checking for injuries with a gentleness that surprised her given their size. "I fell. My ankle." She bit her lip against another wave of pain. "I cannot walk." "I'm going to pick you up," he said. "It will hurt." She nodded, bracing herself, but nothing could have prepared her for the jolt of agony when he lifted her. She cried out and grabbed his coat, burying her face against his chest, and then they were moving. He carried her like she weighed nothing, his stride long and steady, and despite the pain, she felt safe for the first time in months. "Where is your cabin?" he asked. She managed to give him directions, and within minutes they were there. He had to shift her weight to open the door, and then they were inside, out of the killing cold. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was barely warmer than outside. Xander set her carefully on the bed and immediately went to the fireplace. Within minutes, he had it roaring, adding log after log until heat began to fill the small space. Then he brought the kerosene lamp over to the bed and gently removed her boot. Victoria hissed in pain, tears streaming down her face. "It is bad," he said, probing the swollen ankle with careful fingers. "Not broken, I think, but badly sprained. You will not be walking for a while." "What am I going to do?" The words came out in a sob. "I have to work. I cannot afford to miss work." "Right now you need to rest and heal," Xander said firmly. "Where do you keep your food?" she told him, and he moved around her tiny kitchen with surprising efficiency, heating water and making tea, finding bread and cheese and the last of her jam. He brought it to her like she was an invalid, which she supposed she was, and watched until she ate. "Thank you," Victoria said when she had finished. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not found me." "I was bringing supplies to the church," Xander said. "Saw you fall from across the street. Lucky timing." Lucky did not begin to cover it, Victoria thought. If he had come by 5 minutes later, if he had not looked down that alley, she would be dead by now. "You should not be alone tonight," Xander said. "That ankle needs to be watched, and you might have hit your head when you fell." "I am fine," Victoria protested automatically, though in truth, she was terrified of being alone. Xander looked at her, and something in his expression made her stop talking. "I am staying," he said, and it was not a request. He settled into the chair by the fire, his long legs stretched out, his rifle across his lap. Victoria lay in her bed and watched the firelight play across his features, this strange man who had appeared twice now to save her. She wanted to ask him why he was in town, why he kept coming down from his mountain, but exhaustion and pain were dragging her under. "Why do you live up there?" she asked drowsily. "Alone?" Xander was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then his deep voice rumbled through the cabin. "After the war, I could not stand the crowds. Too many people, too much noise. The mountains are clean, honest. They will kill you, but they do not lie about it." "Were you a soldier?" "Scout, cavalry." His face had gone distant, looking at something she could not see. "I saw things I wish I had not, did things I wish I could undo." Victoria understood that. She had her own regrets, her own mistakes that haunted her. "Do you ever get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but lonely is better than broken." She wanted to say more, to tell him that she understood, but sleep was pulling her down. The last thing she remembered was the sound of him adding wood to the fire, the crackle and pop of burning pine, and the strange comfort of knowing she was not alone. When she woke in the morning, he was gone. But the fire was still burning bright, and there was fresh water in the bucket and a note on the table in careful block letters. "We'll check on you tonight. Rest the ankle." Victoria lay in bed and stared at the note, something warm unfurling in her chest. It was not much, just a few words from a taciturn mountain man, but it meant he cared. He had stayed all night to watch over her, and he was coming back. She spent the day in bed, keeping her ankle elevated as best she could and trying not to think about the work she was missing. Mrs. Chen would understand, but that did not change the fact that Victoria needed every dollar she earned. Her savings were dwindling, and winter had been expensive. True to his word, Xander appeared at her door that evening with a basket of supplies. He had brought food from Mrs. Chen, who sent her best wishes and told Victoria not to worry about the store. He had also brought something called a poultice, a mixture of herbs and something else that smelled terrible but felt wonderful when he wrapped it around her ankle. "What is in this?" Victoria asked, wincing at the smell. "Arnica, comfrey, some other things. Old Ute remedy. It will help with the swelling." He worked with calm efficiency, rewrapping her ankle with strips of clean cloth, checking her temperature with the back of his hand against her forehead, making sure she had eaten. It was strange being cared for by this near stranger, but Victoria found she did not mind. There was something soothing about his presence, his unflappable competence. "You do not have to keep checking on me," she said. "I'm sure you have things to do." "I'm staying in town for a few days anyway," Xander said. "Supply run. I do not mind." "Why do you do that?" Victoria asked. "Help people, I mean. Everyone says you want to be alone, but you keep helping anyway." Xander was quiet, his hands still on the bandage he was tying. "Wanting to be alone does not mean I want people to suffer," he said finally. "I just do it from a distance." "That seems lonely." "It is." He looked up at her, and their eyes met. "But it is safer." "Safer for who?" "Everyone." There was a weight to the word, a history Victoria could only guess at. She thought about what he had said last night, about the war, about seeing and doing things he regretted. How many soldiers had come home broken, unable to fit back into the lives they had left behind? Xander stayed for another hour, making sure she was comfortable, stoking the fire high enough to last the night. Before he left, he set a small bell on the table beside her bed. "If you need anything during the night, ring this," he said. "I will hear it." "Where are you staying?" Victoria asked. "The livery. I have a room there." He paused at the door. "Try to sleep. Your body needs rest to heal." For the next 3 days, Xander came by morning and evening, bringing food and fresh poultices, checking her ankle and making sure the cabin stayed warm. Victoria looked forward to his visits with an anticipation that surprised her. They talked during those hours, short conversations at first, then longer ones as they grew more comfortable with each other. She learned that he was 32 years old, that he had grown up in Missouri on a farm, that he had joined the Army at 18 and spent the next decade fighting in the Civil War and then the Indian Wars. He did not talk much about the fighting itself, but she could see the shadows in his eyes when the subject came up. "I built my cabin 7 years ago," he told her on the third evening. Found a valley at 10,000 feet, sheltered from the worst of the wind, with a spring that never freezes. I have everything I need up there. Do you ever think about coming back down? Victoria asked. Living in town again? No, the answer was immediate and firm. Too many ghosts down here, too many expectations. Victoria understood that better than he knew. She had her own ghosts, her own failures that haunted her. Sometimes she thought about leaving Salida, starting fresh somewhere. No one knew her as the woman whose husband had drunk himself to death. But where would she go? And what would be different? What about you? Xander asked. Will you stay in Salida? I do not know, Victoria admitted. I do not have anywhere else to go. That is not the same as wanting to stay. It was not, Victoria realized. She was trapped by circumstance rather than choice, stuck in this town because she lacked the resources to leave. It was not the same as Xander's deliberate isolation, his chosen solitude. His prison was one he had built himself. Hers had been built by Thomas's weakness and her own poor choices. Do you regret marrying him? Xander asked suddenly. Victoria thought about it, really thought about it. No, she said finally. I regret that I could not save him. I regret that I was not enough to make him want to save himself. But I do not regret trying. Xander nodded slowly. You cannot save people who do not want to be saved. I learned that the hard way. Who did you try to save? Myself. He stood abruptly, as if the conversation had gotten too close to something raw. You should rest. I will bring breakfast in the morning. After he left, Victoria lay in the darkness and thought about what he had said. He was still trying to save himself, she realized. That was what the mountains were, what his isolation was. An attempt to heal wounds that might never fully close. By the end of the week, Victoria could put weight on her ankle again. It still hurt, but she could hobble around the cabin, and she knew she would be able to return to work soon. She was grateful for the healing, but there was a part of her that mourned the end of Xander's visits. He came by one last time, checking her ankle and pronouncing it well enough for her to be careful on. He had brought more wood for her fire and enough food to last a few days. I'm heading back up tomorrow, he said. You should be fine now. Thank you, Victoria said, and the words felt inadequate for everything he had done. For everything. I would have died without you. You're stronger than you think, Xander said. You would have found a way. I'm not so sure about that. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his pale eyes. I am, he said finally. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, something that had been frozen since Thomas died, suddenly coming back to life. It was terrifying and exhilarating at once, this feeling blooming inside her. Will you come back? She asked. To town, I mean. Will I see you again? Maybe in a few months, Xander said. Spring, probably. Months. Victoria felt the weight of that timeline settle over her. Anything could happen in months. She could leave Salida, could move on with her life, could become someone entirely different, or she could stay, could wait, could hope that this strange mountain man would come back down from his isolated peak. Be safe up there, she said. Always am. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. You too, Victoria. It was the first time he had used her name, and hearing it in his deep voice made something in her flutter. Then he was gone, and the cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. Victoria returned to work the following week, moving carefully on her still tender ankle. Mrs. Chen fussed over her like a mother hen, making her sit whenever possible and bringing her tea throughout the day. The store was busy with the first hints of spring approaching, miners stocking up for the prospecting season, families preparing for planting. Life went on, as it always did. The days lengthened, the snow began to melt, and Salida shook off winter like a dog shaking off water. Victoria worked and saved her money and tried not to think about Xander alone in his high cabin. She failed spectacularly at that last part. He haunted her thoughts the way Thomas never had, even when Thomas was alive. She found herself thinking about the way Xander moved, the careful competence of his hands, the rare glimpses of humor in his eyes. She thought about his gentleness when he had tended her ankle, the way he had stayed all night to watch over her, the warmth in his voice when he had said her name. It was foolish, she told herself. He had made it clear he wanted to be alone, that he had chosen isolation over connection. She was just someone he had helped, nothing more. Reading anything else into it was the height of stupidity. But her heart did not listen to logic, and as the weeks passed, Victoria had to admit that she was falling for a man she barely knew, a man who might never come back. Spring arrived properly in late April, transforming the mountains from white to green almost overnight. The creeks ran high with snowmelt, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows. Victoria took long walks on her days off, building strength back in her ankle, breathing in air that smelled of pine and possibility. She had been in Salida for 7 months. In some ways, it felt like a lifetime. In others, it felt like she had only just arrived. May brought warmer weather and longer days, and with them came Xander. Victoria was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store when she saw him riding down the main street, his massive form unmistakable even from a distance. Her heart kicked into a gallop, and she had to force herself to keep sweeping, to act like his arrival was no more significant than any other customer. He tied his horse outside the store and climbed the steps, and Victoria was struck again by his sheer size. Months in the mountains had left him even more rugged, his hair longer, his beard fuller, his skin burnished by sun and wind. He looked like something out of a legend, a figure carved from the mountains themselves. "Victoria," he said, and there was warmth in his voice that made her chest tight. "Xander." She leaned on the broom, trying to appear casual. "Welcome back. How was your winter?" "Long, quiet." He looked at her ankle. "You're walking well. No problems?" "None at all. It healed perfectly thanks to you." Something flickered in his eyes, there and gone before she could identify it. "Good. That is good." He went inside to place his order, and Victoria followed, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered his supplies. Mrs. Chen appeared from the back room and greeted Xander like an old friend, asking about his winter and his cabin and his hunting. He answered patiently, his voice a low rumble, but Victoria noticed his eyes kept finding her as he talked. When his order was ready, Victoria helped him carry it out to his horse. The morning sun was warm on her face, and she could smell the lilacs blooming near the church. It was a perfect spring day, full of hope and new beginnings, and Victoria felt reckless with it. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "Few days. Need to get some tools repaired at the blacksmith." He secured the last package to his saddle. "Maybe a week." "Will you come by sometime?" The words were out before she could stop them. "For dinner, perhaps. To say thank you properly for helping me." Xander turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He looked uncertain, almost vulnerable, and she realized he was not used to being wanted. "You do not owe me anything," he said. "I know, but I would like to, if you would like to." A long pause. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right. When?" "Tomorrow evening? Around 6? "All right," he said again, and there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. Victoria spent the next day in a frenzy of preparation. She cleaned the cabin until it sparkled, bought a chicken from the butcher and vegetables from the early gardens, borrowed a good tablecloth from Mrs. Chen. She told herself it was just a dinner to thank someone who had helped her, nothing more. But her racing heart suggested otherwise. Xander arrived exactly at 6, cleaned up and wearing clothes that were only slightly less rugged than his usual mountain gear. He had trimmed his beard and tied back his hair, and Victoria caught herself staring at the strong lines of his face, the startling blue of his eyes. She had made roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, biscuits from scratch, and a dried apple pie with precious sugar. They ate at her small table, and the conversation came easier than she had expected. Xander asked about her work at the store, about her life before Salida, about her family in Kansas City. She asked about his cabin, about the wildlife he saw, about what he did with his long, solitary days. "I read a lot," he admitted. "I have maybe 40 books up there, and I have read them all a dozen times each. I hunt, I trap, I chop wood, I think." "What do you think about?" "Everything, nothing." He took a sip of the coffee she had made. "Mostly I try not to think too much. Thinking leads to remembering, and remembering leads to places I do not want to go." Victoria understood that impulse too. "Is it working? The solitude, I mean. Is it helping?" Xander was quiet for a long time. "It was," he said finally. "For a while it was. But lately I'm not so sure." "What changed?" He looked at her across the table, and the intensity in his gaze made her heart pound. I met someone who made me remember that being alone and being at peace are not the same thing. The air between them felt charged, heavy with possibility. Victoria could not look away from him, from the honesty in his face. "Xander," she said softly. "I should not have said that," he said, standing abruptly. "I'm sorry. I should go." "Please don't." Victoria stood too, moving around the table toward him. "Please, I'm glad you said it." "You do not understand." His hands were clenched at his sides. "I am not a good man, Victoria. I have done things, seen things that would give you nightmares. I live in the mountains because that is where I belong, away from decent people." "That is not true." "It is." His voice was harsh. "I am damaged goods, broken. Your husband may have drunk himself to death, but at least he never killed anyone. I have blood on my hands that will never wash clean." Victoria stepped closer, close enough to smell pine and wood smoke on his clothes. "You were a soldier. You did what you had to do. That does not make it right." "No," she agreed, "but it does not make you a monster either. You saved my life, Xander. You have saved dozens of lives. That has to count for something." He looked down at her, and she could see the war raging behind his eyes, the part of him that wanted to reach for her and the part that was terrified of the connection. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," Victoria said quietly. "God knows I am far from it myself. I just want to know you better, to see if this feeling I have means what I think it means." "What feeling?" She took a breath, gathering her courage. "That maybe we are both running from things we cannot outrun, and maybe we do not have to run alone." Xander raised his hand slowly, as if moving through water, and touched her face with infinite gentleness. His palm was rough and scarred, his fingers calloused, but his touch was feather light. "You deserve better than a broken mountain man," he said. "Maybe," Victoria said, "but I do not want better. I want you." He bent his head and kissed her, and it was like coming home to a place she had never been. His lips were warm despite the chill that seemed to live in him, and he kissed her with a tenderness that made her want to cry. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I do not know how to do this," Xander admitted. "I have not been with anyone in 7 years. I do not know if I remember how." "Then we will figure it out together," Victoria said. He stayed that night, and they talked until the fire burned down to embers and the stars wheeled overhead. They talked about the war and Thomas's drinking and the choices that had led them both to Salida. They talked about fear and loneliness and the ways people hurt each other without meaning to. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk about the future. "I cannot live in town," Xander said. "I have tried and it does not work. I need the space, the silence." "Then I will come to the mountains," Victoria said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "It is a hard life up there. Brutal in winter. No neighbors for miles, no stores, no church. Just you and me in the wilderness." "I know," she took his hand, feeling the strength in his fingers. "But I think I could be happy there. Happier than I have been anywhere else." "You do not know that. You have never lived like that." "No," Victoria agreed, "but I am willing to try, if you are willing to let me." Xander looked at her for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, but we do this slowly. You come up for a visit first, see what it is really like. If you still want to stay after that, we will talk about it more." It was not a grand romantic gesture, but Victoria found she appreciated his practicality. He was not sweeping her off her feet with empty promises. He was being honest about the reality of life with him, giving her every chance to change her mind. "When can I come?" she asked. "Summer," Xander said. "After the snow clears from the high passes. July, maybe." July was 2 months away. If Victoria could wait 2 months, she had already waited a lifetime. They spent the next week together, and Victoria fell more deeply for him with each passing day. Xander was not an easy man, but he was a good one. He was patient and thoughtful and surprisingly funny when he let his guard down. He had a dry wit that snuck up on her and a smile that transformed his entire face. He helped at the store when he had time, carrying heavy boxes and fixing things that had been broken for months. The townspeople watched them with interest, and Victoria knew the gossips were having a field day. "The widow and the mountain man," they probably whispered. "How strange, how scandalous." Victoria did not care. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt alive again. She felt hope. When Xander left to return to his cabin, Victoria stood on the boardwalk and watched him ride away. He turned back once at the edge of town, raising his hand in farewell, and she waved until he was out of sight. The next 2 months passed slowly. Victoria worked and saved money and tried to imagine what her life would be like in the mountains. She bought practical things, sturdy clothes and good boots, a warm coat for the winter. She read everything she could find about survival in high country, about gardening at altitude, about preserving food and preparing for winter. Mrs. Chen watched these preparations with knowing eyes. "You are going to go with him," she said one day. "I think so," Victoria admitted, "if he still wants me after I visit." "He will want you," Mrs. Chen smiled. "That man looks at you like you are water and he is dying of thirst. He will want you." Victoria hoped she was right. July arrived in a blaze of heat and wildflowers. The high country was fully open, the passes clear, the meadows lush. Victoria had arranged to take a month off from the store, long enough to visit Xander's cabin and see if she could truly make a life there. He came for her on a bright morning, leading a second horse for her to ride. They left Salida behind and climbed into the mountains, following trails that got progressively narrower and steeper. Victoria had never been this high before, and she was breathless with more than just the thin air. The world up here was different, more vivid somehow. The sky was a blue so deep it hurt to look at, and the sun felt close enough to touch. Eagles circled overhead, and wildflowers carpeted every open space. The peaks rose around them like the walls of a cathedral, ancient and implacable. They rode for 6 hours, climbing steadily, and Victoria's legs were screaming by the time Xander finally called a halt. They had come to a valley, sheltered and green, with a stream running through its center. And there, nestled against a stand of pine trees, was Xander's cabin. It was larger than Victoria had expected, solidly built from thick logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows. There was a shed for animals, a smokehouse, a root cellar built into the hillside. It looked permanent, a real home rather than just a shelter. "Welcome," Xander said, and there was nervousness in his voice that she had never heard before. Victoria dismounted on shaking legs and looked around. The valley was beautiful, peaceful in a way she had never experienced. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and the gurgle of the stream. No voices, no wagon wheels, no barking dogs, just silence and space and sky. "It is perfect," she said, and meant it. Relief washed over Xander's face. He showed her around the property, the garden where he grew vegetables, the pen where he kept chickens in the summer, the small lean-to where he stored firewood. Everything was neat and organized, the work of someone who depended on order to survive. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a large fireplace, a bed built into one corner, shelves lined with books and supplies. A table and 2 chairs sat beneath the window, and furs covered the floor. It smelled like wood smoke and pine, and Victoria loved it immediately. "You can sleep in the bed," Xander said. "I will take the floor." "We will figure something out," Victoria said, not wanting to displace him in his own home. They fell into a routine over the next few days. Xander showed her how he lived, the rhythms of his days. They rose with the sun and worked until dark, tending the garden, hauling water, chopping wood. It was physically demanding work, harder than anything Victoria had done in town, but she found she did not mind. There was something satisfying about it, the simple cycle of work and rest and sleep. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked, or read, or simply enjoyed the silence together. Xander taught her things he had learned from years in the mountains, how to read the weather, how to identify edible plants, how to tell if a storm was coming by the way the animals behaved. "You are good at this," he told her on their 5th day. "Better than I expected." "I like it here," Victoria admitted. "It is peaceful. No one asking questions, no one watching to see how I grieve or judge the choices I make. I can just be." Xander understood. That was what he had found here too, the freedom to simply exist without the weight of others' expectations. As the days passed, they grew more comfortable with each other. They moved around the cabin like dancers learning a new routine, anticipating each other's movements, working together with increasing ease. And at night, when the fire burned low and the stars came out, they sat close on the porch and talked about everything and nothing. "I think I could stay here," Victoria said one night. Not just for a visit. For good. Xander turned to look at her, the firelight reflecting in his pale eyes. Are you sure? This is not an easy life, Victoria. Winter here is brutal. We could be snowed in for months with no way to get supplies. If something goes wrong, there is no doctor, no help. I know, Victoria said, but I would rather face that with you than spend another year in town without you. He took her hand, his thumb rubbing slow circles on her palm. I'm not an easy man to live with. I have nightmares sometimes. I get quiet and withdrawn. There are things I carry that I cannot talk about. I'm not easy either, Victoria said. I have my own ghosts, my own regrets, but maybe together we can make something good, something neither of us could make alone. Xander pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, and Victoria felt at peace for the first time in years. They talked about practicalities over the next few days. Victoria would need to go back to Salida to gather her things and say goodbye to Mrs. Chen. She would need warmer clothes for the winter, more supplies, books to read during the long, dark months. Xander made lists with careful attention to detail, making sure they would have everything they needed to survive. We should get married, he said one evening, and it was so matter-of-fact that Victoria almost missed it. What? We should get married, he repeated, before you come back. I know it is not romantic, but it would be practical. If something happens to me, you would have legal claim to the cabin, the land. You would be protected. Victoria felt her heart squeeze. It was possibly the least romantic proposal in history, but it was so perfectly Xander that she could not help but smile. Is that the only reason? She asked. He looked at her and his expression softened. No. I want to marry you because I love you, because you make me want to be more than the broken thing I have been for the past 7 years, because when I imagine the rest of my life, I cannot imagine it without you in it. That is better, Victoria said, her eyes stinging with tears. Yes, I will marry you. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and when they finally broke apart, they were both smiling. I will come down in August, Xander said. We can get married in Salida, do it properly. Then we will come back up here together before the first snow. It was a plan, a good plan. Victoria felt excitement building in her chest, anticipation for this new life she was building. She spent 2 more weeks at the cabin, learning everything she could, committing the rhythms and routines to memory. She helped Xander hunt and fish, learned to shoot his rifle with reasonable accuracy, practiced starting fires in all kinds of weather. He was a patient teacher, explaining things clearly and praising her progress. When it was finally time for her to return to Salida, Victoria felt torn. Part of her wanted to stay, to never leave this beautiful valley and the peace she had found here. But she knew she needed to go back, to tie up the loose ends of her old life before she could fully commit to her new one. They rode down together, and Xander stayed for 2 days before heading back to the high country. He met with the preacher to arrange the wedding, spoke with the land office to officially register Victoria as his wife, made all the practical arrangements with his typical thoroughness. On his last night in town, they sat in Victoria's cabin and finalized their plans. I will come back on August 15th, Xander said. We will marry on the 16th and head back up on the 17th. That will give us time to get settled before winter. August 15th, Victoria repeated, committing it to memory. You can still change your mind, Xander said. No one would blame you. I'm not going to change my mind. You might. When you are back in town, around people, you might realize this is crazy. Victoria took his face in her hands. Xerxes Xander, I love you. I am going to marry you. I'm going to live in the mountains with you, and I am not going to change my mind. He kissed her fiercely, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright. I will live long, he said. You know that, right? I am not like your first husband. I will not drink myself into an early grave. I will be here with you for as long as we both shall live. I know, Victoria said, and she did. Xander was nothing like Thomas. He faced his demons head-on rather than drowning them in liquor. He chose life, hard as it was, rather than the slow suicide of addiction. Her first husband drank himself to an early grave, Xander said, quoting the gossips with a wry smile. That's what they all say about you. Let them say it, Victoria said. My second husband will live long. We will live long together. It became their promise to each other, their vow. He would live long. They would live long. Together. August arrived with warm winds and afternoon thunderstorms. Victoria spent her last month in town preparing, buying supplies, saying goodbye to the people who had become her friends. Mrs. Chen cried when Victoria told her she was leaving, but she was happy too. "You have found your place," Mrs. Chen said, hugging her tight. "Not many people do. I am happy for you." The church ladies were scandalized, of course. The widow, running off to the mountains with that strange man. It was improper, it was unseemly, it was downright scandalous. Victoria smiled and nodded, and ignored them all. She did not care what they thought. She was done living her life for other people's approval. Xander arrived on August 14th, a day early, because he said he could not wait any longer. They were married the next day in the small church, with Mrs. Chen and the blacksmith as witnesses. Victoria wore a simple blue dress, and Xander wore his cleanest clothes, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Xander kissed her like she was air and he had been drowning. They spent their wedding night in Victoria's cabin, and she finally let herself hope that this was real, that she had actually found happiness again. Xander made love to her with reverent gentleness, as if she was something precious, and afterward they lay tangled together and talked about the future until they fell asleep. They left Salida at dawn, leading a pack train of 3 mules loaded with supplies. Victoria looked back once as they left town, taking a mental snapshot of the place where she had learned to be strong again. Then she turned her face forward, toward the mountains, toward her new life. The climb took longer with the heavily loaded mules, and they spent one night camped beside a stream before reaching the valley. When they finally crested the last ridge, and Victoria saw the cabin nestled in its green hollow, she felt something in her chest settle into place. Home. She was home. They spent the rest of August settling in. Xander showed Victoria where he kept everything, how he organized his supplies, which animals were likely to raid the garden, and how to deter them. They worked together from dawn to dusk, preparing for winter, and Victoria had never been happier. September brought cooler nights and the first yellow leaves. They harvested the garden and spent long days preserving food, canning vegetables and drying meat and storing potatoes in the root cellar. Xander taught Victoria to tan hides, a long and smelly process that would provide warm clothes for the winter. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and read aloud to each other from Xander's collection of books. They had 43 books between them now, Victoria having brought her own small library from town. They would have plenty to read during the long winter nights. "Are you happy?" Xander asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the peaks orange and gold. "Yes," Victoria said simply. "Are you?" "More than I thought possible." He pulled her closer and she rested against his solid warmth. "I spent so many years thinking I did not deserve happiness, that I had done too much, seen too much, to ever have a normal life. But with you I feel almost normal again, almost human." "You are human," Victoria said. "A good human. You just needed to forgive yourself." "I am working on it," Xander admitted. "It helps having you here, having a reason to keep living rather than just surviving." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out, and Victoria thought about how far she had come. A year ago, she'd been burying Thomas, lost and broken and without hope. Now she was married to a mountain man, living at 10,000 feet, preparing for a winter that might kill them if they were not careful. And she had never been happier. October brought the first real snow, a foot of heavy wet flakes that blanketed the valley overnight. Victoria woke to a world transformed, everything white and sparkling in the dawn light. Xander showed her how to navigate in the snow, where to step to avoid hidden obstacles, how to read the surface to judge its depth. They finished their winter preparations, bringing in the last of the firewood, securing the shed and smokehouse, moving the chickens into a shelter attached to the cabin where they would be safe from predators. Xander checked and rechecked their supplies, making sure they had enough of everything. "We should be fine," he told Victoria, "but if we have a hard winter, we might get low on some things by March. We will just have to be careful." Victoria trusted him. He had survived 7 winters up here alone. He knew what he was doing. The first blizzard hit in late October, and it was like nothing Victoria had ever experienced. The wind screamed around the cabin, shaking the walls, and snow fell so thick she could not see the shed just 20 feet away. They stayed inside for 3 days while the storm raged, keeping the fire high and rationing their movement to conserve body heat. On the third night, Victoria woke to find Xander sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with haunted eyes. She went to him, wrapping a blanket around both of them, and he pulled her close without speaking. "Bad dreams?" she asked softly. "Memories," he said. "The snow makes me remember. We got caught in a blizzard once, my unit. Lost 12 men to the cold before we found shelter. I can still hear them screaming." Victoria held him, letting him talk, letting the memories come. He told her about the war, about the things he had seen and done, about the friends he had lost and the men he had killed. He had been holding it all inside for so long, and now it poured out in a flood of words and grief. When he finally fell silent, Victoria said, "You survived. That is what matters. You survived, and you have made a good life. Those men would not want you to punish yourself forever." "I know," Xander said, "but knowing and believing are different things." "Then believe me," Victoria said. "You are a good man, Xerxes Xander, a strong man, a man who has saved more lives than he has taken. Your past does not define you. What you do now, that defines you." He kissed her then, and she could taste salt from tears she had not seen him shed. They made love there by the fire, slow and tender, reaffirming life in the face of all the death he carried. The storm finally blew itself out, and they emerged to find the valley buried under 5 feet of new snow. It took them most of a day to dig out the shed and make sure the animals were all right. The chickens were disgruntled but alive, and the mule they kept for emergencies was warm in his stall. November and December passed in a blur of routine. They rose with the sun, tended to the animals, cooked and ate and read and talked. Sometimes they went outside to hunt or check the snares Xander had set, but mostly they stayed close to the cabin, conserving energy and warmth. Victoria learned the rhythms of winter survival, the careful rationing of supplies, the constant attention to the fire that kept them alive. Christmas came and went quietly. They had no tree, no presents, just each other and a special meal Victoria cooked using their precious reserves of sugar and dried fruit. But it was the best Christmas Victoria had ever had, because it was spent with someone who truly loved her. On Christmas night, lying in bed with Xander's arm around her, Victoria realized she was completely, thoroughly happy. Not the conditional happiness she had felt with Thomas, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. This was deeper, more solid. This was the happiness of being exactly where she was meant to be. January brought brutal cold, temperatures that dropped to 30 below and stayed there for weeks. They burned through wood at an alarming rate, and Victoria understood why Xander had insisted on cutting so much. The cold was a living thing, a predator constantly testing their defenses, looking for any weakness in the cabin walls or their resolve. But they survived. They huddled together for warmth, read every book they owned twice, played endless games of cards and checkers. Victoria taught Xander to knit, and he made her a lumpy but warm scarf. He taught her to carve wood, and she made him a set of reasonably functional spoons. In the deepest part of winter, when the cold was so extreme that just breathing hurt, Xander told her he loved her at least once every day. As if he needed to remind himself that there was warmth in the world, that not everything was ice and darkness, Victoria always said it back, and she meant it more each time. February brought the first hints that winter might eventually end. The days started getting longer, imperceptibly at first and then more noticeably. The cold remained brutal, but the quality of light changed, becoming less harsh, more hopeful. They were low on some supplies by now, coffee and sugar mostly, luxuries they could live without if they had to. But they had plenty of the essentials, meat and flour and beans, enough to see them through to spring. "We made it," Victoria said one morning, standing at the window and watching the sun rise over the peaks. "We survived our first winter." "You did well," Xander said, coming to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Better than I expected, honestly. I thought you might go crazy with the isolation." "I thought I might too," Victoria admitted, "but I like the quiet, and I like being with you. That's enough." March arrived with warmer temperatures and the first bare patches of ground. The snow began to melt, slowly at first and then faster, and the sound of running water returned to the valley. Xander and Victoria emerged from the cabin like bears from hibernation, blinking in the strong sunlight, stretching muscles that had been confined too long. They began preparing for spring, cleaning the cabin from top to bottom, airing out bedding, taking inventory of what they had left and what they would need. They were low on ammunition and some staples, but nothing critical. Xander would make a trip to Salida in May to resupply. April brought wildflowers and returning birds, and Victoria felt herself blooming along with the landscape. She had survived her first mountain winter, had proven to herself that she was strong enough for this life. And more than that, she had deepened her relationship with Xander, learning his moods and rhythms, finding the balance between closeness and space that every couple must discover. It was in late April when Victoria realized she was pregnant. She had missed 2 monthly courses and her body felt different, tender in new ways. She said nothing at first, wanting to be sure, but when the nausea began in the mornings, she knew. She told Xander one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply. He went very still beside her. Then, slowly, he turned to look at her, and his eyes were wide with wonder and terror in equal measure. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I think it will arrive in December, maybe early January." "A winter baby." Xander's hands were shaking. "That is dangerous up here. What if something goes wrong? There is no doctor, no midwife." "Then you will deliver it," Victoria said calmly. "You have delivered foals and calves. A human baby cannot be that different." "It is completely different." But even as he said it, Victoria could see the fear giving way to something else. Hope, maybe, joy. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes." Victoria took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." Xander pulled her close and buried his face in her hair, and Victoria felt him shaking. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I never thought I would have this," he said. "A wife, a child, a family. I thought I had given up my chance at normal life when I came to the mountains." "This is not normal life," Victoria pointed out. "This is extraordinary life, but it is ours." They spent the next few weeks making plans. Xander would go to Salida in May and bring back medical supplies, books on childbirth, anything that might help. They would prepare the cabin for a baby, make a cradle, gather supplies, and they would pray that everything went well because that was all they could do. Xander left for Salida in mid-May, promising to be back within a week. Victoria stayed at the cabin, continuing her work, trying not to worry. She was healthy and strong, and women had been having babies in difficult circumstances for all of human history. She would be fine. Xander returned 6 days later with a mule loaded with supplies. He had brought everything Victoria had asked for, and more, including a midwife's kit he had convinced the doctor to sell him, complete with instruments and instructions. He had also brought fabric for baby clothes, soft yarn for blankets, and a dozen books on childbirth and infant care. "I may have gone overboard," he admitted as they unpacked everything. "No," Victoria said, touched by his thoroughness. "This is perfect. Thank you." Summer passed quickly. Victoria's belly grew, and she found she had to modify her work to accommodate her changing body. She could still do most things, but Xander increasingly took over the heavier tasks, insisting she rest more than she thought necessary. "You are carrying precious cargo," he told her when she protested. "Let me do the heavy lifting." He was adorably overprotective, always watching to make sure she did not overwork herself, bringing her water and snacks, rubbing her aching back at the end of the day. Victoria found it endearing and annoying in equal measure, but mostly endearing. They talked about names during the long summer evenings. If it was a boy, they would name him James after Xander's father. If it was a girl, Eleanor after Victoria's grandmother. They prepared the cabin, setting up a corner with the cradle Xander had built, gathering soft blankets and tiny clothes Victoria sewed by lamplight. Autumn came again, a year since Victoria had first come to Salida as a widow. So much had changed since then. She was married, pregnant, living in the mountains with a man she loved more than she had thought possible. Life was hard but good, challenging but rewarding. The first snow fell in October, right on schedule, and Victoria felt the familiar tension of preparing for winter. But this year was different. This year they were preparing not just for their own survival, but for a baby who would arrive in the deepest part of winter. November passed without incident. Victoria grew larger and more uncomfortable, but she remained healthy. Xander watched her like a hawk, jumping at every wince and twinge, convinced she was going into labor. She found his anxiety amusing, though she did not say so. December arrived with heavy snow and brutal cold. Victoria's due date came and went with no sign of the baby. Xander grew more nervous by the day, and Victoria tried to stay calm for both of them. "Babies come when they are ready," she told him. "There is nothing we can do but wait." The contractions started on a clear, cold night, 2 weeks before Christmas. Victoria woke Xander, and he immediately went into action, building up the fire, heating water, laying out the medical supplies with shaking hands. Labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Xander stayed with Victoria the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, talking her through the pain. He had read all the books, studied all the instructions, and now he put that knowledge to use with steady competence. The baby arrived just after dawn, a healthy boy with strong lungs and a full head of dark hair. Xander caught him, cut the cord with trembling hands, and placed him on Victoria's chest with tears streaming down his face. "James," Victoria whispered, looking at her son. "Hello, James." The baby opened his eyes, impossibly blue like his father's, and looked at her with ancient wisdom. Then he yawned, showing pink gums, and Victoria fell completely in love. Xander collapsed beside the bed, exhausted and elated. "You did it," he said. "You were amazing." "We did it," Victoria corrected. "Both of us." They spent the next few days in a haze of exhaustion and joy. Baby James was healthy and hungry, nursing enthusiastically and sleeping in short bursts. Xander was a natural father, gentle and patient, singing to the baby in his deep voice and walking him when he fussed. "I never thought I could be this happy," Xander said one night, holding his sleeping son. "I spent so many years thinking I did not deserve it, but here you are. Here he is, my family." "Your second chance," Victoria said. "Our second chance," Xander corrected. They made it through that winter, all three of them, learning to be a family in the depths of the Colorado mountains. It was hard, navigating the demands of a newborn while also surviving the brutal cold, but they managed. They took turns sleeping, worked together to keep the cabin warm and clean, supported each other through the exhaustion and stress. Spring finally arrived, and they emerged from the cabin with their son, showing him the world he had been born into. James looked at everything with wide blue eyes, taking in the mountains and sky and wildflowers with apparent wonder. "He's going to grow up strong up here," Xander said, watching his son reach for a butterfly. "Wild and free." "Like his father," Victoria said. They settled into a routine over the next year. Victoria healed from childbirth and regained her strength. James grew rapidly, hitting all his milestones on schedule, thriving despite the isolated environment. Xander made periodic trips to Salida for supplies, but they were gone no more than a few days, always eager to return home. On their second anniversary, Xander surprised Victoria by reading her a letter he had written. "I am not good with words," he said, unfolding the paper with hands that shook slightly. "But I wanted you to know what you mean to me." He read about how she had saved him, brought him back to life when he had thought he was too far gone, about how she had given him purpose and hope and a reason to live long instead of just surviving, about how every day with her was a gift he had never expected to receive. Victoria cried through the entire reading, and when he was done, she kissed him and told him she loved him, that she would always love him. "Her first husband drank himself to an early grave," Xander said, quoting those old gossips with a smile. "But her second husband will live long. I promise you that, Victoria. I will live long with you and our son and whatever other children we might have. I will live every day to the fullest, grateful for this life we have built." "I know you will," Victoria said. "We both will." And they did. They lived long together in their mountain valley, raising James and eventually 2 more children, a daughter they named Eleanor and another son they called Daniel. They survived harsh winters and beautiful summers, faced challenges and celebrated triumphs, built a life that was uniquely theirs. Xander never forgot the darkness he had seen, the things he had done in the war. But with Victoria beside him, he learned to live with those memories rather than being consumed by them. He learned that he could be more than the sum of his mistakes, that redemption was possible if he was willing to work for it. Victoria never forgot Thomas or the pain of watching him destroy himself, but she learned that one failed marriage did not mean she was destined to fail at love. She learned that she was stronger than she had known, capable of surviving and thriving in one of the harshest environments on earth. Together, they built something beautiful and lasting. They taught their children to be strong and self-sufficient, to respect the mountains that were their home, to understand that hardship was part of life, but so was joy. They loved each other through good times and bad, through sickness and health, through all the seasons of their lives. Years passed, and their children grew. James became a tracker like his father, learning the mountains and animals with the same instinctive knowledge. Eleanor was fierce and independent, climbing trees and hunting with her brothers, refusing to be constrained by what girls were supposed to do. Daniel was the gentle one, the reader and thinker, content to spend hours watching birds or studying plants. When James was 16, he asked his parents how they had met. They told him the story about the widow and the mountain man, about Victoria's first husband who had drunk himself to an early grave, and how Xander had promised to live long. "Have you kept that promise?" James asked his father. "Every day," Xander said, looking at Victoria with love in his pale eyes. "Every single day." The children eventually grew up and left, James to become a guide in the mountains, Eleanor to marry a rancher and run her own spread, Daniel to attend college in Denver and become a teacher. Victoria and Xander found themselves alone again in their valley, coming full circle to where they had started. "Do you ever regret it?" Xander asked one evening as they sat on their porch, now weathered with age, watching the sunset. "Coming up here with me? Giving up an easier life in town?" "Never," Victoria said firmly. "This has been a good life, a hard life, but a good one. I would not change a moment of it." "Not even the hard parts?" "Especially not the hard parts. They made us stronger." Xander took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "I love you, Victoria Xander. I have loved you since the day I found you in that alley, though I did not know it yet. You saved my life in every way that matters." "You saved mine too," Victoria said. "We saved each other." They sat together as the stars came out, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together in the most unlikely of places. They had faced grief and hardship, isolation and danger, but they had faced it together, and that had made all the difference. Xander lived to be 78 years old, strong and healthy until the very end. He died in his sleep one winter night, peacefully, with Victoria beside him. His last words were, "I told you I would live long." And he had. They both had. They had lived long and well, built a family and a legacy that would outlast them both. Their children thrived, and their grandchildren came to visit the cabin in the valley, learning the stories of the widow and the mountain man who had found love in the wilderness. Victoria lived 5 more years after Xander died, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, content in the knowledge that she had lived fully and loved deeply. When she died at 81, it was in the same cabin where she had spent most of her adult life, looking out at the mountains she had come to love. They buried her beside Xander in a meadow overlooking the valley, with the peak standing watch overhead. And if anyone had asked, they would have said that Victoria Sutton Xander had lived a remarkable life. She had survived loss and heartbreak, had found love again in the most unexpected place, had raised a family in the wilderness, and lived to see her grandchildren thrive. Her first husband had drunk himself to an early grave, that much was true. But her second husband had lived long, just as he promised. And together they had built something that would endure long after they were both gone, a testament to the power of love and second chances and the courage to start over when everything seems lost. Their story became legend in Salida, told and retold over the years. Some said it was a romance, others called it a survival story. But those who knew the truth understood it was both, and something more besides. It was a story about healing and hope, about finding home in another person, about the ways love can redeem and transform even the most broken among us. And on winter nights when the snow fell thick and the wind howled down from the peaks, people in Salida would sit by their fires and tell the story of the widow and the mountain man. They would talk about how Victoria had lost everything and found everything again, about how Xander had come down from his isolated peak and discovered that he did not have to face his demons alone. Her first husband drank himself to an early grave, they would say, shaking their heads at the waste of it, and then someone would smile and add the rest. But her second husband, that mountain man, he lived long, they both did, and they were happy. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. Not the hardships they had faced or the obstacles they had overcome, but the simple fact that they had found each other and built a life together, that they had loved deeply and lived fully, with courage and hope and unwavering commitment to each other. Their cabin still stood in the high valley, maintained by their descendants, a monument to what two determined people could build together. And on clear nights, when the moon was full and the peaks were silver with snow, some said you could still feel their presence there. Two souls who had found peace and purpose in each other and in the wild beauty of the Colorado mountains. It was a good ending to a hard beginning, a happily ever after earned through patience and perseverance and love. And for Victoria and Xander, that was more than enough. It was everything.